And we're back like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Friday evening here with me in New York. Well, once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. Once again, a boxing themed episode, which many of you have told me how much you enjoy, and I certainly enjoy discussing the sport of boxing from the greats of bygone era, whether it's the Jack Johnsons and Jack Dempsey and Jack Sharkey, or more current heavyweights such as Alexander Usyk, Tyson Fury, Anthony Joshua, or the golden age of heavyweights. Today is George Foreman's 76th birthday. And it's really amazing to think that not only is he still with us, but he's such a vibrant presence online, loves to poke fun at himself, enjoys meeting fans. He's just such a character, and it is really extraordinary the kind of turn that he made at a certain point during his first retirement, where he just transformed into a people person and someone who loved meeting fans, and the smile was never far behind. And so George Foreman can lay claim to being one of the greatest fighters who ever lived. It's not really even debatable. And he's somebody who was, in his own way, freakishly, insanely talented. Even though watching him in the ring, even as a younger fighter, you saw a brute, almost a dreadnought, just a one-man wrecking crew where you wouldn't necessarily think in terms of him being a prodigy for the sport. It's just a guy who was an absolute bruiser in there. But unlike some of George's contemporaries, and in particular his great rival and then very close friend, Muhammad Ali, Ali, as Cassius Clay, had a shit ton of amateur fights before reaching the Olympics. Now, the young Cassius Clay was an insanely talented kid who moved up through the ranks, and I believe he won a Golden Gloves fight when he was maybe 172 pounds, and he beat a guy who weighed over 200 in the finals. I believe that was also at Madison Square Garden in 59. So there are some people you say, look at how much talent. But then you look at George Foreman. Now, he went to Mexico City, and he won the Olympic gold medal famously in 1968, and there was a lot of upheaval. That was a very controversial Olympics, and George Foreman won the gold medal and pulled a little American flag out of his trunks and walked around the ring. And he always talked about how the excitement he felt in that moment, but that he personally was a product of what he called a compassionate America. He was somebody who dropped out of high school and unfortunately may have gone the way of Sonny Liston and become a convicted felon, and the Job Corps saved him. And that's how he got into boxing. He didn't just, in a kind of apocryphal story, which I feel like is probably true, that young Cassius Clay was not a kid who was necessarily into boxing. He had a bicycle at age 12. The bicycle was stolen, and he showed up at Joe Martin's gym not far from where he lived in Louisville, Kentucky, and said he wanted to whoop the chump who stole his bike. And that's how he got his start. Well, George Foreman was dropped out of high school, was in the Job Corps, and began to learn how to box. Unlike, for example, Joe Frazier, unlike Cassius Clay, who had just a crazy amateur record at 106-2, just ridiculous. George Foreman had only 20 amateur fights before landing in Mexico City for the 1968 Olympics. 20. Mike Tyson had an extensive amateur career. He just missed making the 84 Olympic team. It probably would have been better if they had just gotten him on there anyway. But Foreman showed up for those Olympics. Raw, green, but supremely talented. And unlike Cassius Clay, who had a tough fight when he beat Ziggy Petrikowski to take the light heavy gold medal in 1960, and Joe Frazier, he didn't have that difficult of a time winning gold in 64 in Tokyo. But George Foreman, in the finals, the gold medal fight, he fought a Russian who was a top-level amateur fighter. George just ran right through him. Fight wasn't competitive. He busted the guy up. I think he broke his nose. Cassius Clay broke Ziggy Pietrzykowski's nose in his gold medal fight. That's how he won, though. Cassius needed to win that third round. The fight was up for grabs. And true to form, future Muhammad Ali came out there and just banging right, left, dodge, boom. The guy was bleeding all over the ring. The Russian, was it Chapulis, that Big George beat in 68? He was bleeding all over the ring also. Stoppage. TKO to win the Olympic gold. And then when George turned pro, he didn't really have that many difficult fights. Probably the toughest fight he had up to and including when he defeated Joe Frazier in 73, the Greg Peralta fight. Was that 1970 or 71? But Greg Peralta, if I'm not mistaken, I'm sorry if I got this wrong, I believe that Greg Peralta opened up a cut on him. I think. I seem to remember that coming up in a different fight. It may have been Bob Sheridan during the Foreman-Ali fight in Zaire, where he mentioned that this was maybe George's toughest fight so far since Peralta opened a cut on him. But George Foreman was this incredible talent. And even as he dominated the heavyweight division on his way to the Sunshine Showdown in January of 73 against Joe Frazier, when somebody has mostly really easy fights, it's difficult to kind of gauge how badly they burn to win. How much are you willing to give up? How deep are you going to draw? How much of a reservoir do you have? And what's going to happen when you get taken into deep water? And George Foreman, with all of those easy fights, and the fact that he knew how to throw an uppercut, he knew how to jab, he knew how to throw a lead right hand. But he threw these strange roundhouse punches. And that's what people said. He looked raw even when he was heavyweight champion. You look at the fight with Ali, there's a moment towards the end of the first round where George throws a punch, which Ali jokingly referred to as the anywhere punch, where he just sort of winds up and windmills a right hand. The technique it's not technique. So he was just a guy who hit so damn hard wherever he threw and however he threw. If he caught you right, you were fucked. It was almost always just that simple. But you can find he actually did have good technique, but he just sometimes started winging, and Ali was able to use that to his advantage in Zaire. But the general rule of anywhere punch is just don't let him hit you. Because anywhere he hits you, it's going to hurt. And if it doesn't hurt, fight might be over because you're unconscious. So George defeated George Chuvalo and other top heavyweights of the day and had to fight with Joe Frazier in 73. And Joe had one defense after defeating Ali, the famous fight of the century, which at the time was such an incredible gate. And I believe it was the first major fight where they were able to simulcast what they called closed circuit, where the fight was at Madison Square Garden, but people filled arenas such as the Philadelphia Spectrum, and they paid $10. I don't know how much they paid, and they would have food and whatnot, and then they would be able to see the fight live. That particular time, the tech wasn't quite there, and it didn't work out as well as many people hoped. And I feel like the Spectrum, the spectators were so pissed off that they trashed it because they paid their money and didn't work properly. But Joe had one more title defense against Ron Stander, and then he went in there against Big George, and in the immortal words of Howard Cosell, down goes Frazier, down goes Frazier, down goes Frazier. And Howard could have said it 7 times because Joe Frazier, undefeated world heavyweight champion, Olympic champion. Think about how sports and life, sometimes you say to yourself, this is impossible that it happened this way. Frazier, Foreman, Ali, inextricably linked as pros, as competitors, as people who had maybe their ups and downs on a personal level, and then ended up being on friendly terms. You know, Joe never had a problem with George as a person, and George never had a problem with Joe as a person. They just, they fought twice, but it wasn't personal. It was business. It was the sport. But Cassius Clay, later Muhammad Ali, wins Olympic gold in 1960. Joe Frazier wins Olympic gold in 64. George Foreman wins Olympic gold in 68. It's almost mind-boggling, the symmetry. And then those three guys end up having the careers. The only two men to ever beat Joe Frazier were those two guys. It's crazy. But it all happened. And so George went out there, even though he was the betting underdog, because he'd had so many easy fights. How do you gauge what's going to happen when you get out there? And George has always kind of poo-pooed and downplayed, oh, I was scared. I don't believe that he was really scared. I think he went out there very confident that he had the right style for George. Now, for Joe. When you talk about styles making fights, and there are certain people who would pose matchup problems for anybody. There is nobody where that you could definitively say based on how they fight, well, Ali would be easy. No. You might have the advantage, but somebody that can do different things, that doesn't just have one mode or more or less one mode, it's different. But George Foreman had the kind of skill sets. It was not a good matchup for a swarmer. And Joe, like Mike Tyson, was a swarmer. He knew one way to fight moving forward. And his process was, I'm going to take a couple of shots to get my lick in. It worked to an extent against Ali. It worked against the Bob Fosters of the world. Hell, it worked against Jimmy Ellis, for that matter. That's how he got the title. But against George, by the time George landed the second punch, Joe was on the canvas. It didn't work with that guy. Because George, not that George couldn't crowd people, but he was not a wild swinger, even though he had wild swings. He was very methodical in the ring. He was someone who looked like a plotter, but he really wasn't. His footwork was better than it appeared to be. And a lot of people talked about this. The fact that he had the appearance of someone who was slow, he was not. He had the appearance of somebody that couldn't deliver certain punches, also not true. But he was not a swarmer. He was a very patient fighter for somebody who you would think, well, if he's raw, he's just going to go. No. He knew how to take his time out there. And Joe, he also knew Joe was going to come to him. And he just chopped him down. And the matchup was so bad for Frazier. If they had fought 100 times, maybe Joe beats him once, maybe twice. It's almost inconceivable given how much bigger George was and how well George took good shots. You could really lay into George and he barely moved. I don't think that Joe, it wasn't a fight that he could realistically win. And in the rematch, Joe landed some shots, but it didn't move George. It was just a matter of time. George was just going to walk him down, and it was a good stoppage. The first fight was not a good stoppage. Arthur Mercanti, the late, great Mercanti, many would have him as the greatest ref ever for boxing. He let the first fight go on too long. They shouldn't have even allowed it to go past the first round. But that's beside the point. George Foreman, still undefeated, obviously, when he beat Joe Frazier, he seemed invincible. He was Sonny Liston 10 years later, who seemed invincible until young Cassius Clay took his title in what was mostly a very easy fight, except for when the kid got whatever crap that was in his eyes and was blind in the fifth round. But other than that, Sonny was just punching and hitting air. Or as, Jerry Eisenberg famously said, Sonny couldn't hit Clay in the ass with a canoe paddle. Like, that's how bad it was. He wasn't just missing. He was missing by this much. So after George fought Joe, he fought Ken Norton, who had split 2 fights with Muhammad Ali, and took him out in 2 rounds. Another fight that was not competitive. So George was just obliterating everyone. You imagine, think about, and this is something that Mike Tyson experienced too, and if you want to compare Sonny Liston, George Foreman, Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson was the only super aggressive swarmer fighter of those. Sonny and George, their technique was simple. Sonny had better technique, but they were more patient fighters. Sonny was a guy who would start with the jab. He knew how to keep distance. George had a really powerful jab, knew how to keep distance. He was very, very careful with his footwork. Sonny Liston was a guy who also didn't look super coordinated, but he was super coordinated. So George had not really had difficult fights. And you look at Iron Mike Tyson, how easily he separated Trevor Berbick from the title, how easily he defeated Larry Holmes, how the way that he demolished Michael Spinks and Tony Tubbs. He had a tough fight with Tony Tucker, but he won it going away. Tucker really couldn't do anything. Same with the Bone Crusher Smith fight. So the thing is, Tyson had that intimidation that George had, but Tyson had some boring fights because the other guy didn't want to engage. Most of George's fights were at least exciting. When he beat Jose Roman, I mean, that's an action fight. He almost took Roman's head off, but at least Roman came there to mix it up, and he wasn't going to try to clutch and grab. And this was something that Mike always said about Michael Spinks. Yeah, it was 93 seconds, but Michael was out there trying to win. He didn't want to do 10 years later or 8 years later. Bruce Seldon, as Ferdy Pacheco said, he held on to Tyson like he was holding on to a life raft for until the third round. He didn't really want any part of him. Or maybe that was Buster Mathis Jr. I always get those two fights confused when Tyson's comeback before he got the title back. But George was not tested. He wasn't tested. He hadn't really been tested since the amateurs. And when he signed to fight Ali for what became the most famous fight in the history of professional boxing, the Rumble in the Jungle, there was no reason for him to think that it was not going to be an easy fight. It's not that he didn't respect Ali. He did. He was a big fan of his, coming up through the ranks in the 60s. I'm sure he watched all of the fights that he could, felt that he got a raw deal from the establishment. All that stuff is true. But George has talked about this. He even talked about it in the When We Were Kings documentary, the Oscar-winning documentary about that fight. He said, sometimes it's really simple what you think. I beat both guys that he had lost to, and I beat them easily. Neither guy got through 2 rounds. So why would I even hesitate to fight? Or as he always said, Mohammed, why would I even hesitate to fight Mohammed? That was the fight to make, and I wasn't worried or scared. I kept telling myself, he can't punch. When a fighter says about another fighter, he can't punch, he doesn't mean it literally. George's interpretation of he can't punch, I believe, meant he can't knock me out with one shot. He can't punch. He's going to have to outpoint me. So George famously ended up losing that fight. He lost it pretty badly because he appeared to be in control, but he really wasn't. There was almost a mirage in the first 3 or 4 rounds because George was very active and he landed shots, but he really didn't land any big shots, or if he did, Ali appeared to be okay. And George never wavered in the belief that he could win the fight. He never even considered the possibility that he could lose. So he wasn't looking to conserve energy. There wasn't anything to indicate that he was going to lose. And then in the 5th round, because you could argue that the first 4 rounds, the fight maybe was 2-2. It could have been 3-1. I feel like Ali was probably in the lead because the judges would give him close rounds because he looked so good dictating pace, even though he was on the ropes and George was winging. And if you were in attendance, you might have thought, well, Ali's just getting the shit kicked out of him. He's lost the first 4 rounds here. Maybe he won the first round. But the 5th round of that particular fight, there are things that happen in sports, there are things that happen in life, where if you're watching it live, and obviously I wasn't, I was less than a year old, you don't realize what you're seeing until it's over and you can sort of take stock as to what's happened. And in the 5th round, Foreman, who had seemed as if he was starting to get tired, and Ali was apparently in control in the first part of the 5th round. Well, Ali was on the ropes, and George seemed to get some steam back, and he threw a couple of body punches, and one right to the body in particular, that I'm telling you, based on my understanding of boxing, that punch is supposed to end the fight. At the very least, it's Arturo Gatti dropping to a knee, screaming in pain against Mickey Ward. And I don't know how he got up from that, but he did. George landed a howitzer right hand on Ali, and he almost seemed to back up, waiting for the guy to fall. And not only did Ali not fall, however he managed to control his face, I don't know. But not only did Ali not fall, but he almost immediately said, "Is that all you got?" George in later years said, when he not only didn't drop, but when he said, "Is that all you got?" I knew I wasn't winning this fight. I knew I wasn't winning the fight because I hit him exactly. You can't do it better. And for all the stuff with the technique, George did something there that was magnificent. It was Mike Tyson-esque, where he tricked his opponent. He went one way and came back the other way because Ali was getting into a rhythm and a pattern of defending his side when George did that. And he had his body crinkled up enough where it was not easy for George to get him with a big shot to the head. And Ali went to defend one side, and George nailed him. And when he didn't go down, when he didn't even seem winded 10 seconds later, Ali rallied at the end of the round, and some people might have even given him the round, which is crazy given how many shots, how many times George was just hitting him with everything there. But the only clean shot he hit was the body shot. George lost that fight, and it was really bad, and he had a lot of difficulty, and he made excuses after the fight. I would say that George was not really given a correct count. Zach Clayton was counting 8, and he waved the fight over. But Archie Moore, who was in George's corner, he said, I'm not blaming Zach. The fight was over. It doesn't matter whether or not the referee counted 10. He could have just stopped the fight anyway because there was no reason to let George continue. But in that fight, George did not quit. He did not give up. He was willing to go into deep water. Even if he started to think, I'm not winning this fight. He's still out there to win. He's still trying to throw bombs in the 7th round, in the 8th round. It's just that Ali had the look of a guy who knew he was going to win. So that's a deep water fight that George lost, but he didn't lose for any other reason than he was against a guy who he had the magic. There were just certain people that have the magic. Ali had the magic. And George then, he was devastated. He was crushed. He couldn't believe that he had lost, first off. And he had a fight with Ron Lyle not long after the Ali fight. I don't think it was his first. He had the thing where he fought a bunch of guys, like 5 men in one night. That kind of, I'm not really into that sort of stuff. But the fight with Ron Lyle was not so much a turning point, but it showed how badly George wanted to win. Because there are those moments in boxing where a fighter gets hit hard enough where he does not remember getting up from a knockdown or does not really remember being hit, where they black out. Now, for someone's long-term health, this is not a good thing. But in the moment, the competitive spirit, whatever burns within the subconscious of an elite-level fighter, George Foreman took 3 knockdowns in that fight with Ron Lyle. And Ron Lyle was one hell of a fighter. When they talk about the 70s being the best decade for heavyweights, the way they explain it, when I say they, I mean general boxing experts, there were so many high-end fighters who never won a share of the heavyweight title that in the 80s would have been given Mike Tyson all he could handle. And Ron Lyle was one of those guys. Tyson would be favored, but the Ron Lyle that faced Foreman, the Ron Lyle that was ahead against Ali before Ali caught up to him, that guy would be a tough out for any heavyweight who ever lived, including the guys from today. Tyson Fury would be favored, but it would not be an easy fight. Ron Lyle was a guy who learned how to fight in prison. He had really good form. Whoever taught him beautifully, would be how I would describe it. But George tells a story of the fight with Ron Lyle, where Lyle squared him up, and he said one of the knockdowns, it didn't even hurt. And the way George said it didn't hurt, as if that was a good thing, I don't know. I thought it was funny. He was smiling, but I don't think he was really trying to be funny. But what George said was, when I went down, and the first thought in my head was, what excuses are you going to make for yourself tonight? What excuses are you going to use, George? So he said, no matter what, I was going to get up. And he not only got up, but he won the fight. He showed that he had the heart of a lion, the heart of a champion. He was not just a front runner. He wasn't just a guy with unbelievable talent who had coasted. He was somebody who burned to win as much as Joe Frazier, as Ali. So he got up and he beat Ron Lyle. And then unfortunately, he lost to another great fighter from the decade, Jimmy Young. Now, Jimmy Young was the kind of boxer that nobody was afraid to face, but he was really good at making you look stupid. Think of Terrence Crawford as a heavyweight. Now, maybe Jimmy Young was not as talented as Terrence Crawford, but that's the kind of fighter he was. Young was a guy who seemed to let his opponent dictate the pace just so he could rat-tat-tat counter punches. And George went out there and he was in control of the fight, and Young just came back on him. And honestly, George was really lucky to reach the final bell. He was very fortunate to even get to hear the decision. And that's when he had his out-of-body experience, when he said he felt God. He felt God. And that's when he left the sport of boxing for a decade and became a preacher. And one of the ironies during his comeback, when he fought Jerry Cooney, which was a key fight for him, they called it the preacher versus the puncher, meaning that Jerry Cooney was the puncher. I mean, there are people that would say that George Foreman is the greatest puncher in the history of boxing. So to call him the preacher, they're almost kind of underrating him and overrating Jerry Cooney. But that's beside the point. George's comeback was looked upon as a novelty act until he fought Jerry Cooney, which was, I want to say it was on MLK Day in 1990. I think it was Martin Luther King Day. But Mike Tyson had not fought Buster Douglas yet. That fight was about a month away, maybe 3.5 weeks away. And when George went out there and crushed Cooney the way that he did it, because a lot of people thought George can't fight because he hadn't looked that good in a lot of his comeback fights. So there was a sense that this is a waste of time. Cooney's probably going to win. And is anybody going to want to see Jerry Cooney fight Mike Tyson when Michael Spinks really beat Cooney badly? No, thank you. You know, we're all set here. But what ended up happening was George was dominant. He looked great. Cooney landed a couple of big shots in the first round. George weathered. And in the second round, he just unloaded with a fusillade of punches. And he actually, they called it the walk-off uppercut. Jerry went down from a couple of shots, got up, and George had a look on his face almost like, my cousin Vinny, I'm finished with this guy. He had a look like, okay, I've had enough of Jerry Cooney, throws an uppercut, and Cooney almost freezes. George lands one more shot. Joe Cortez drags him off, crashes to the mat. It was a stunning performance by George. Certainly the best performance of his comeback up to that point. And that's what ended up ultimately, more than a year later, that's how he got the shot with Holyfield. He was so dominant against Cooney, and then Mike Tyson lost to Buster Douglas, and Evander Holyfield beat Buster Douglas. That's how George Foreman got his title shot. And Foreman lost the fight from here to there. Evander won at least 9 of the 12 rounds. But George was the definition of a live underdog. He was throwing leather, and Evander kind of jokingly said, he hit me with a shot in the 5th round. I thought he had knocked all of my teeth out. And historically speaking, the fight with Evander looks better for Evander than it did at the time because of what ended up happening 3.5 years later. That George Foreman regained the heavyweight title 20 years after the disaster in Zaire. He regained the title in a fight where, you know, Michael Moorer had beaten Evander for the title, and rather than give Evander an immediate return, Evander had health issues. He had some heart problems. Michael Moorer decided to fight George. And the irony is that Michael Moorer was a supremely talented fighter, probably would have been better as a cruiser. But he boxed brilliantly for 9 rounds against George. Brilliantly. And then he made the mistake in the 10th round of, he just stopped moving. I don't know if he thought he could knock George out. Good luck with that. But he gave George enough of a target, and George got through with the big shot. And unfortunately, it was one of those shots that didn't hurt because his lip was split wide open. And I would imagine under normal circumstances, that would hurt so much that you couldn't possibly be unconscious. I mean, he hit him so hard. It didn't look like a loaded punch, but George knew how to throw a straight right hand. Everything wasn't always those big roundhouse punches. He regained the heavyweight title. It's one of the most incredible stories in the history of sports. He was 45. That's not a sport, boxing, that you should be out there at 45. And he won the world heavyweight title. And he continued to box until 1997. He lost a disputed decision to Shannon Briggs, and he he walked away. And I'm glad he did. George Foreman's lifetime record is 76-5. You know who beat him? Ali, Jimmy Young, Evander Holyfield, Tommy Morrison, the late Tommy Morrison, and Shannon Briggs. That's it. 76-5. And he made a lot of money, of course, in his comeback. And then after he retired, he got into the indoor grilling machines, which made him hundreds of millions of dollars. So not only was George Olympic champion, two-time world heavyweight champion, he had a network sitcom on ABC called what? George. Big surprise. He was in the When We Were Kings documentary, got to go on stage with Ali and Will Smith, who was the presenter at the 1997 Academy Awards to celebrate the win for Best Documentary Feature of When We Were Kings. Highly recommended, by the way, if you haven't seen a terrific documentary. And then George made hundreds of millions of dollars selling indoor grilling machines. It's just such a stupendous story of success against the odds. You could say that about a lot of boxers. You could say that about Tyson 100%. George Foreman is just a fascinating personality and a great sportsman. And somebody who did make that turn and is so likable. There are a lot of people, if under 30, that didn't even know he was a boxer, that don't know him for anything other than the infomercials and the grilling machine, even though he sometimes would wear boxing gloves in the infomercials. He sometimes would make references to, if you buy the wrong equipment, you'll be down for a lot longer than a count of 10. Just sort of randomly throwing that out there. No, he's making boxing references because he was a boxer. But much the same way that Joe DiMaggio became Mr. Coffee to a generation of young people. Yeah, that's the guy that does the coffee. No, that's Joltin' Joe DiMaggio. That's the greatest living baseball player, Mr. Coffee. People know only what they're presented, right? We accept the reality with which we're presented. You see a guy, a funny guy on TV, a big dude selling grilling machines. That's what he does. He's just a guy who invented a grilling machine. George Foreman is a lot more than just a guy who invented a grilling machine. Now, there was the movie last year starring Chris Davis as George. It's not that good. In the realm of boxing-themed biographical films, it's better than the Muhammad Ali film, The Greatest. I like it just because Ali plays himself, but the film, it's not very good. This is better than that. It's not as good as Raging Bull. It's not as good as Somebody Up There Likes Me. And it's not as good as the Ali film with Will Smith, which although is flawed, it's very, very solid and worth seeing. And Big George Foreman didn't do that well at the box office. A lot of critics really liked it. And if you haven't seen it, it's certainly worth the shot. Chris Davis looks the part. And yeah, why not, right? But George Foreman, 76 years old today. I used to love listening to him with Larry Merchant and Jim Lampley when he would do the HBO boxing broadcasts. And my favorite ever quote from George Foreman: follow a boxer to take his crown, follow a puncher, you get knocked down. And that's what happened in the fight with Michael Moorer. What was it, November 5th, 1994? Michael Moorer started to follow George. He stood in front of him, and he not only got knocked down, but the fight was over. Happy 76th birthday to an American original, one-of-a-kind, Big George Foreman. This has been episode 404 of the Confessions of a Not-So-Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Friday evening here with me in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Until then,